Providence is eternal vision, providere. It's as though God, the Blessed Trinity, had been calmly watching a great video from all eternity. We discover things bit by bit, but there are no surprises for God. And so things which happen disastrously are part of a greater plan, a part of a pattern. Don't fight against that pattern. Accept things. We are not God, we receive, history included. And so it was that Patrick was involved in a terrible, terrible disaster at the age of 16. Rather like Joseph, there was a vision. He was being prepared, as Joseph was, with the language and culture of the Egyptians. So Patrick knew how the Irish ticked, and he didn't have to come back. But it was put on his heart. He listened then in prayer to what the Lord was wanting, and indeed he had either a dream or a vision. Young man, come back. He was calling, that is, Ireland itself, the poor lost souls of Ireland, worshipping idols, involved in Druidism and therefore in some form Satanism, were calling him back to bring the light of grace and true faith and knowledge, as we have in this first reading. How will they believe if they do not have a preacher? However, what we forget is that by the time he came back, he had passed through an important circuit where much cross-fertilization was taking place. It is fairly certain that he spent enough time on the island, for instance, of Les Reims, an important point of intersection of monastic culture, actually to this day. It's a Cistercian monastery, and it worships in the present rite, but using Eastern chant, actually. A very interesting phenomenon, and a good monastery, faithful to the ideal and blessed by the Lord. Actually, its abbot became bishop of Arles, I think, in Arles. He, therefore, spent time there in that place where the likes of John Cassian passed. He was the tape recorder of the ancient regime, the desert of old. He, after his profession with his friend Germanus in the Holy Land, obtained permission to go to the source, and down he went with his friend to Egypt, taking the equivalent, yes, of a video camera. It was his notepad, and on it he wrote what we have to this day, and which precisely formed the West also, for St. Benedict wanted him read. The word collatio, collation, comes from that. The conferences, it's the same word, collatio. They are read, theoretically, before Compline in a Benedictine monastery. And they are reading Cassian, who is the tape recorder of the Eastern regime. So there we are. That's where he also was formed, on that holy island where these had been. And he came back with this baggage, the best of the East and the best of the far, far West, where we are. And it's the only case, really, in big evangelization where big-time martyrdom, bloodshed and huge violence was not actually involved. Probably because he knew how they ticked. He was able to get through to them, and rather like the Jesuits after him, much later, he knew how to hit hard, go to the top, and the rest will follow. The importance, therefore, of dialoguing with people who have influence. But he himself, as we know from his own writing in the Confessions, was helped, because he himself actually, and he confesses it, was amazed at the power at work in him and around him. He's confessing, I didn't do it myself. And it's what you will hear if you talk to those involved to this day in frontline combat in the first wave of evangelization, e.g. in darkest Africa. Things actually happen, not just human, because it has to be so. people believe what they see. And as in the Acts of the Apostles, so in the first line of evangelization, things start to happen before people's eyes, and that's actually what counts with simple people. Seeing power. The wave of conversion was quite dramatic. Holy virgins, sons of kings, daughters would give themselves to the Lord in consecrated virginity and in the monastic life, because the Celtic Church was very monastic from the beginning, as actually in Wales. If you go to Wales, every other village is called llan something. Well, llan is literally an enclosure. A wynllan is a place where you enclose vines, therefore a vineyard. Perllan, the same as an orchard. But a llan on its own, followed by the name of a saint, is the enclosure of a monastery, and it becomes then a parish church as time goes on. Hugely monastic, and indeed the abbot was very important, so much so that when it came then to a few generations later, this light from the far west, from, in that case, Iona, going back through evangelization again of a re-darkened Europe in the Dark Ages, they were carrying with them the ancient light of the West, which is also the light of the East, in the strict monastic life following St. Columbanus. They were also missionaries because they did everything, ready for every good work. The structure was basically the structure of the Holy Spirit. Pray and let God command, and things would happen, all anchored in prayer. But when it came then later on to their coming back to Europe, around about 700, 800, that kind of period there, in the 700s, essentially, because the abbot was so powerful, the bishop in that part of the world would be frustrated. Who's boss? So tension would come, and we find in the night of St. Columbanus what goes on. He goes from one place to the other, founding monastery after founding monastery, Luxeuil, Gubbio, Corbie, and all the rest of it down to Italy, because it's uncomfortable for him to stay too long. He's too powerful, and also too austere, because the Celtic rule was serious stuff. So what happened? Charlemagne, Charles the Great, who by the way was the founder of our monastery in Italy, he had this notion: we can't have these two rules. I command, it was the Holy Roman Emperor. Henceforth, in the whole Holy Roman Empire, there will be one only rule, and I will make sure that happens. So what did he do? He sent scribes to the Holy Mount, Monte Cassino, founded by St. Benedict, and got an authentic codex of the rule, copied, and in those days publication happened with sweat and quill. It went round the scriptoria of the West as the only rule hence to be followed. And so it was that St. Benedict took over in Europe, and how he's now called patron of Europe, because also inbuilt was culture. They carried on even pre-Christian culture. And eventually, after the Synod of Whitby, the two dates of Easter, that of the Celtic Church based precisely on the East, and that of Rome, were brought into line, and there was to be only one observance, which, by the way, in brackets, is what Benedict XVI was hoping for before the end of his pontificate. You know that he drew up some kind of written means of obtaining union between East and West if the East accepted, including, therefore, this question crucial for the date of Easter. It's a scandal there should be two Easters, except once every 5 years. But it hasn't yet been accepted by the East. However, it shows what the Holy Spirit is nudging, but that's a little parenthesis. What happened then was that Ireland continued to be very, very faithful to this light received from St. Patrick. Probably one of the most faithful countries in the Christian world, actually. It was a huge nursery of saints, scholars, and missionaries. A very large number of missionaries, and they're still out there, actually, although they're getting older, are around the Christian world. And of course, we in Wales were completely dependent on them. It used to be called the mission at your doorstep. Now, when it came then to England, in that same Providence, France was protected by that forevision coming into a poor girl called Joan. That little pucelle of the age of 18, 19 was raised up to protect France from what was going to happen down the line. Joan of Arc had the ear of the Dauphin, the future king, the real heir, and she was trying, or God was trying through her, to sever France from what was going to be this terrible, terrible thing down the line if they remained under the English power. And so it was. Ireland was less fortunate. What happened over the water, essentially, originally, because of one man's problem with his wedding, had huge repercussions. And so we have this terrible, terrible persecution of the Irish people, of which volumes like this tell it all. A friend of mine, someone has come to you actually, Damien, he got this with his poor means reprinted. You know the story? He found it in a garbage heap or somewhere, and he said, "This has to be known." So out of his own pocket he got it reprinted. It's the Martyrs Unknown of this Emerald Isle. Torture, prison and rack. Of course we have our own great example nearby, Oliver Plunkett, the last to be hanged, drawn and quartered at Tyburn, late in time. In that same Drogheda, so many things happen. This little volume is an account of the fidelity of the Irish to the Holy Mass, and how, under all duress, they tried and they succeeded to keep it going in hidden corners of our land. We have here this testimony. On the same day, Father Francis Heelan, a very aged Franciscan, was seized at the foot of the altar, no less, in Drogheda, just as he had concluded Mass. While being hurried through the town as a prisoner, the news spread. The women rushed from all sides. Stones and missiles were used with great effect, and he was rescued. There's no point in going into detail, but that in itself shows that people were massively protecting and shielding their priests, and they could be themselves martyred if they were found to do that. What did they do? They only had one option. This actually goes into how they had to handle it, even officially. The priest had to have 1 or 2 hosts in his private house. He couldn't have a chapel in case somebody was dying. Under certain extreme circumstances already there, they were authorized to let a layperson, without touching the host, carry a pyx to a dying person, because the priest couldn't move. But no one was to touch the host. If that was happening, the person receiving communion was to put his tongue into the pyx and take it up on the tongue without touching it. And we have testimony here when the priest was taking the Blessed Sacrament. He had to have a protection around him. It was done with great reverence, shielding and honouring the Blessed Sacrament, and no talking while that was happening. So what did they do? They did it in houses and on the Mass rocks. It would have looked something like this. This corresponds pretty closely to the truth. Everything in there is a detail which is, as it were, photographic. The Sacred Heart picture on the wall, the shoddy roof almost collapsing, it's a thatched roof, the basin, the candles, the missal perched on 2 books, because that's the best they could do, and a young priest, obviously just ordained from Rome, with even his top hat next to him. He's been riding around, coming to poor people. But actually, they're not here in any way emaciated. They're simple poor people, but they're surviving. And you can see all ages there expressing their faith. And that expression of faith is something we want to retrieve. I saw it actually last week in Italy. It was still there. I noticed, for instance, when it came to Holy Communion, it was very reverent. And even though they had the choice between kneeling and, well, actually we were all standing there because there weren't any kneelers, but between receiving it on the tongue and in the hand, they were very hesitant about receiving it on the hand. And I noticed the nuns, who were quite young, they would actually open their hands, but they wouldn't touch it. What I mean is they would take it with reverence, holding as a throne their hands, but then they would put their tongue to their hand and lick up the host rather than touch it with the other hand. That was interesting because no one had taught them to do that. It was the one that instinctively they felt that was the way it should be done, which is actually close to the way the early church would have done it, because this second part of taking it as a tweezers is a recent thing which was never in church history. Anyway, that's another story. But this element, just look at what's going on here. That woman there, she's on all fours. They're all in their own way expressing true devotion. And by the way, that man there, who's probably the fiancé of the girl next to him, he's on one knee. And that comes from the penal times. It's still there a bit in Irish culture, the one knee thing. It's because they were ready to go in case they came. Now, what I want to zoom into just for a second is where we are now. We have still in the air massively this cultural Catholicism, which actually is good and bad at the same time. What's good is that we have an instinct of faith, and God is part of the conversation, and in the Irish language is very much part of the conversation, even in our greetings. What is bad is that it actually brings down the level of celebration, because it's not the same as that commitment you find in some countries where it's not a social thing but a thing of choice. Because in the air, in Ireland, you've got this mentality of the quickie and the minimum and getting your duty done. It doesn't help, because tolerance value for quality then is very low. The other B side is this. There's a whole plethora of things associated with the Irish way of life, which, as long as it was still, as it were, a satellite, a solar system affair around the centre, which was the Blessed Sacrament, Sunday Mass at the right time, was okay. And never, until recent years, would the GAA ever put anything on a Sunday morning. Now, that bit is in question. And it's sad, because although Irish sport does keep people out of further mischief sometimes, it's no longer honouring God when it's taking his throne on a Sunday morning, because it divides families. The other thing is this. Those parts of Irish culture which have always been there and tolerated need to be looked at. Bad language. The manly man who has to hold his Guinness. These are questionable. You can't have a bit of grace. You can't sort of be in love with God. He is in control and in command of the whole of culture, and has to be entirely graced, not just bits of it. The other, smoking. It's hugely Irish and still there. And now we've got other ones. People programmed by satanic forces using people who don't know what they're doing. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. I mean, people in control of the media are being, unfortunately, taken away from their culture and plugged into foreign cultures in the hearth itself, where before the rosary was. The rosary which kept the faith alive for centuries when they couldn't have anything else. Now, let's see what's on the goggle box and take in all the demons coming out of it. A field day for old Nick, who wants this last jewel in his crown. So I leave you with this, which I composed years ago when a novice in Dublin. I'd been sent to do some theology in Milltown with the Jesuits, and it was St. Patrick's Day. And I was listening and watching in Dublin to the scene on St. Patrick's Day. And I thought, wow, football and Guinness, football and Guinness, more football and more Guinness to honour the saint of our eye.
We are coming to you from the Cathedral of Holy Trinity, which is the Cathedral Church of Ireland and Downpatrick in Northern Ireland. This cathedral church is very special because, according to tradition, St. Patrick himself is buried here, and indeed quite close to this place is Schlemish Mountain, which according to tradition was the place where Patrick was held in captivity, where he prayed to God many times during the night and during the day. And when he came back to Ireland, prayer was very much central to his life and to his work of evangelization here.
Ave corpus natum de Maria Virgine, vere passum immolatum in cruce pro homine, cuius status perforatum proximita qua et sanguine, est nobis pregustatum mortis in examine. O Iesu dulcis, O Iesu pie, O Iesu Fili Mariae. Two sonnets written in student days while a Norbertine novice studying in Dublin on St. Patrick's Day in the early 90s. Football. For all the world to move around a ball, so small, so round, so bound by frenzied ire of bounds unknown, for one white spot to call the eyeballs of a populace entire, from sockets startled, rolled all into one soul-absorbed direction, for all hope of bliss and misery to turn on none but bounced fate, for which lands tug and grope. This is the height of earth's civility, where matters of great moment matter more than mutterings of uttered verity, tossed in a world apart, 'neath some heart's door, unknocked, unentered, yet kicked oft a time, for none to this round planet stopped to climb. Alcohol. There sparkles yet a demon in the wave of molecules undamned, and damned fumes traverse the coddled cells that softly rave a little more as each loose lip consumes the master of its speech. And as the night rose into thicker dark, the spark of wit that was in the first sip knows not its might, nor will the dawn recall what carried it. O little glass,
so empty, and so full of humankind. What verity so foul dost thou from unleashed entrails so well pull that thou canst disembody e'en a soul, and in a moment pour out a life into the abyss where long wept Erin's wife.